Okay, like I mentioned in the previous video, if you watched it, I wanted to discuss with you running the new Air on a 30 amp service. There's probably a fair amount of coverage with respect to the differences between 30 amps and 50 amps, which I'll get into in this video because I think it's important. What's probably less common is the understanding of running an all-electric coach, especially a sort of a luxury class coach on 30 amps, and what that involves doing. While it's possible, I found it irritating. So I'm going to document what I went through just so you understand what that's like. And feel free to ask me any questions in the comments for sure. So I think the best way to understand the difference between 30 amp service and 50 amp service is to describe it in a way that's not entirely accurate from like an electrician's standpoint, but conveys the image and knowledge that you need to know when you're thinking about the amount of power that you have available in the RV. So I have both a 30 amp plug here and a 50 amp plug. Now, when I say 30 amp and 50 amp, that's not enough information to tell you how much power is available, because power is a product of amps and volts. And I'm not going to give you, a class on that. I think that's not important. I think what's important is to understand that just calling something 30 amps or 50 amps doesn't give you the full picture. And that's why there's a lot of confusion in this area. And I see it all the time on the forums, people misunderstanding what 30 amp means, what 50 amp means, because there's 30 amps at 120 volts. There's also 30 amps at 240 volts, which you'll see more commonly for household dryers. 50 amps pretty much tends to mean 240 volts, so that's definitely clearer. But what's happened is that when we talk about campground service, it's talked about in terms of 50 amp service and 30 amp service, and that's it. What's missing, again, is the voltage component of that. So 30 amps at campgrounds is 120 volts, 30 amps, not 240 volts, 30 amps, like you have for your dryer. It's 120 volts, and that's a big difference. And 50 amps is 240 volts. So one easy way perhaps to visualize the difference, you can clearly see if you're physically studying the difference in these plugs that this one has 4 prongs and this one has 3. If we ignore the ground prong for a moment on both of these, so pretend like these round ones don't exist, right? What matters is that this has 3 conductors and this has 2. So in any circuit, you need 2 conductors to complete a circuit in order to provide power. This has 2. And from here to here, if you were to put a meter between these two, you would measure 120 volts. And you have 30 amps at 120 volts available here. With the 240 circuit, or the 50 amp circuit at 240, what happens is that now you've got 3, right? So if you put a meter between here and here, you get 120 volts. And if you put a meter between, again, this one here and here, you get 120. If you put it across these two, you get 240. But what's important to understand is that between here and here, you have 120 at 50 amps. And between here and here, you have another 120 at 50 amps. So one common way to think about the actual difference here, or to understand the difference in power that you have available, is that this is actually 50 plus 50, or 100 amps worth of power, if you will. But this is 30. So the real difference is 30 versus 100. Right now you kind of get a sense of this is more than 3 times as much power as available than this, right? So there's that key understanding that comes into play. And at least the way the silver leaf panel works in the new era, it only provides for confusion when you're running on 30 amp service. So what's going to happen is if you run your 50 amp RV on 30 amp service, what's going to happen is that the dog bone adapter that you use is going to take the 30 amp service and provide 30 amps on leg 1 and the same 30 amps on leg 2. So what's going to happen is, you remember when I said that the 50 amp service is 50 plus 50? So that's leg 1 is 50, leg 2 is 50, so the total is 100. When you're on 30, leg 1 and 2 are sharing the same 30 amps. So if leg 1 is reading 15 amps and leg 2 is reading 15 amps, that's a total of 30. You've maxed out your 30 amp connection. Even though they're separate legs, in that case, it's the sum of the two that's important. Here, I'm on 240 volt 50 amp service, so leg 1 and 2 are actually separate legs. They're not shared. So it's not a matter of summing these two. It's, where I would have, well, in this case, the 0 is a poor example, but if I had 15 up top and 15 down below, it's not a matter of, oh no, I'm using 30 out of 50. It's really, one way to look at it is I'm using 30 out of 100, or more technically accurate, I'm using 15 out of 50 on the top and a 15 out of the other 50 on the bottom. So either way that you look at it, it's important to see that what I could do to max myself out here on my 50 amp service is I could have 50 amps on the top and another 50 amps on the bottom before I'm maxed out for a total of 100. But again, on 30 amp service, the sum of these can't be more than 30. Huge difference between 30 and 100. And you can see right now, I'm not entirely sure what's consuming power per se. I'm going to guess floor heat, the refrigerator, the charger, etc. Right? If I were on 30 amp service, I'm already using, with nothing major turned on, I'm already using 11 amps out of my 30. Turn on the microwave, that's another 12 to 15 amps. Turn on the toaster, 12 to 15 amps. Turn on the cooktop, 12 to 15 amps. Turn on the clothes dryer, 12 to 15 amps. If you're running your Oasis with the AC, right, that's, if these are both on, that's 15 amps, right? Very, very quickly, you run out of power with 30 amps. So what I had been doing was, while I was on 30 amp service, I went to the Oasis configuration and I shut off AC and I went to burner only. That way I was never consuming electrical power for this and I didn't have to worry about consuming power there. Now you may be asking yourself, what about load shedding? And I'll get to that in a minute. I'm gonna leave that for the latter half of this discussion. Let's pretend like we don't have load shedding. So I shut those off and leave the burner on only. So now I'm not worried about consuming power from there. Now floor heat, you can certainly shut off. I actually, even though the temperature outside is almost 70, I actually have the floor heat on really low because it keeps the tile comfortable to walk on in bare feet, even at these temperatures. Now the way floor heat works is it's on or off. It's not a matter of, if you set it to 1 or 2, it's only going to use a little power. And if you set it to high or 10, it's going to use a lot of power. It doesn't work that way. The way floor heat works is it's on or off, and changing these numbers between 1 and 10 just controls how long it's on for and how long it's off for. So it cycles on and off as a way to control the temperature. So if all three of these zones were to come on at the same time, I would consume something like 12 or 15 amps worth of power. I forget the exact number, right? Again, 12 or 15 amps out of 30, that's a heck of a lot, right? So my floor heat became an issue. And then, like I mentioned in all the other examples, if I'm running the clothes dryer, that's a good 12, 15 amps. And if I'm running the clothes dryer and maybe I'm running the coffee machine or the microwave or the cooktop at the same time, I'm really running on the edge. And it's very easy for me to pop my 30 amp breaker at the pedestal outside if I go beyond that for an extended period of time, right? And that was the situation I was frequently running into. I'd be drying my clothes, right? And that takes a couple of hours, right? So I have 2 hours of time where I'm consuming an extra 15 amps worth of power. That's half my power, right? Just for the clothes dryer. Where if I come in here and I want to cook, if I want to turn on the microwave, if I want to use the toaster oven, if I want to make a coffee, I have to be very careful about what else is running. And I was constantly running into that. I found that very annoying. So while it's possible, it was annoying. Now, fortunately, in this climate, you'll notice the other thing I haven't mentioned here is heating or cooling. Now, you can, if you're going to use heat, you can tell it to use the Oasis instead of the heat pumps, so that you aren't using electrical power for your heat if it's above 40 degrees outside. If it's below 40, it's going to use the Oasis. But if it's above 40, the heat's going to use electrical power, right? Again, you don't have a lot of that. And the 2 heat pumps each consume 12 amps. If they're both running, you're using 24 amps. That's almost your entire service. Same thing for cooling. If you're running your air conditioning, it's gonna be difficult to do on 30 amps of service. So if you're running the dryer and one zone of cool, you're done. That's it. You can't turn anything else on. You can't run your microwave. You can't cook. You can't do anything else. So that's the scenario that I was running into. Now, again, I'm going to get into load shedding in a minute, but let's dig in a little bit into how the Nuaire, at least on the Silverleaf system here, deals with the power configuration and when you plug into a dog bone. So I should have brought the dog bone in for demonstration, but what happens is the dog bone adapter will adapt the 50 amp plug that you have on your cord on the RV to a different plug. So actually, that's kind of silly. This is the dog bone adapter. So it takes the 50 amps, right, and converts it into a 30 amp plug so that you're able to plug in to a 30 amp receptacle on the pedestal. Now, what is this actually doing? Because there's only 2 conductors on 30 amps, what it ends up doing is it takes these 2 conductors and shares it to these 3 conductors. So if you pull power from one leg, from this set of conductors, if you pull 15 amps, it's the same as pulling 15 amps from here. If you pull 30 amps here, it's a little more accurate to describe it this way. But if you're pulling 30 amps here, it's going to end up being the same as pulling 30 amps here and 30 amps here. Yeah, this is definitely difficult to describe. So what's happening at the RV is that the RV is expecting normally that it's got a total of 50 amps available here and a total of 50 amps available here. So if leg 1 is pulling 50 amps, what it's getting translated to here is 50 amps here. Now that's too much. It's going to pop the breaker. So the most you can do here is 30 amps here, and that's going to translate to 30 here. But again, these 2 combinations are shared to the other end. So if you're pulling 30 here, you have nothing left to pull here, because if you try to pull 30 here and 30 here, it's going to translate into 60 here, and that's going to pop your breaker. So on average, you can pull 15 on one leg and 15 on the other, or basically the sum of one leg and the sum of the other leg can't be more than 30, right? And that's what this thing is effectively setting up to do. So that's why the Silverleaf panel looks like it still has 2 legs, because it knows about this and it knows about this combination. It doesn't really know what's happening here per se, but the standard setup for dog boning from 30 to 50 amps is it shares these 2 normally separate circuits and makes them one. So you just have to remember that when you're looking at the panel here, that even though it still shows 2 separate legs, it's actually the same, and it becomes a matter of summing these two, 5 and 3 in this case, so 8 out of 30 if I were connected to 30 amp service, right? So now if we go into load shed configuration, it's kind of a weird place to have to go to in order to set up this configuration, but you can also plug the new air into a 20 amp circuit or a 15 amp circuit. So for example, if you're just going to park the RV, shut everything down, but you want to leave the charger on, which I've done, or if you're just going to be inside with, maybe watching television and like nothing else, you can certainly run off of 15 amps. So, I've done that. So, but what you have to do in order for the system to be smart enough with respect to managing loads is tell it that when you're connected to single phase, and I'll tell you what that means in a minute. When you're connected to single phase, it needs to know that you're connected to a 30 amp circuit or a 20 amp circuit or a 15 amp circuit. So you're able to do that by clicking on settings. So you can tell it to try and automatically detect the phase. Normally you would leave that to automatic, but you can override that. By default, you're on dual phase, and that's 50 amp services dual phase, and I'll describe what that means in a second. If phase detection automatic detects that you're single phase, or you force this to single phase, that's where this number comes into play. So if you're plugging into a 30 amp service, this setting is appropriate. But if you're going to plug into a 20 amp service or a 15 amp service using some other adapter, you need to change this number so that the system knows you don't have 30 amps available total, you have 20 or 15, so that it can do proper load management. Not quite sure if that was an earthquake or if that was just wind. About 80 miles nearby, we had a series of earthquakes that we could feel here. And this is certainly something you will almost, I can't imagine, ever change unless you are actually plugging into a dryer outlet, which is 240 volts or dual phase. And then you would set this to 30 as well. But normally this is 50 dual phase. So let's talk about single phase and dual phase. Now, based on what I told you, you'll remember that this is a circuit and this is a circuit, or leg 1 and leg 2. And one way to look at it is that it's the sum of these two, so 100 amps, or the other way to look at it is 50. You have 50 amps of power here, and you have 50 amps of power here, but no more than 50 on this one or 50 on this one. You can also draw, if you have a 240 volt device, which is pretty rare in an RV, and certainly the New Air does not have any 240 volt appliances. You can draw across the two of these for a maximum of 50 amps at 240. So, single phase means you have basically one neutral and one hot connector, so just these two. Dual phase means you've got 3 connectors, which means you've got your sort of your neutral connector here. So you've got leg 1, this is one phase, and you've got leg 2, this is another phase. That's why it's called dual phase. You've got 2 phases here, whereas you only have 1 phase. These 2 connectors basically represents those 2 flat connectors. That's single phase. Throw this 3rd connector in, now you've got dual phase. Okay. So that's how you understand and set the system up to do the right thing. Now this becomes important with load shedding, and that's why I've left that for last, because it was important to understand all of this. So you can see that it's detected dual phase, and because I've told it that if it sees dual phase, I've got 50 amps. So this is telling me what my current power configuration is. And I can go over to loads and I can see some information about my loads. It's still showing me the same information I know about my 2 legs. And here you can see that the load shedding system is aware of these different loads. It's able to control these loads. These are loads that can turn on and off in order to keep you under a particular threshold. So if I'm running both AC elements of the water heater, all 3 heating zones for the floor heat, and both air conditioning units, right, on 30 amps, this will absolutely overwhelm a 30 amp connection. So what it's going to do is the load shedding system is going to turn these off for you in a particular priority order to in an attempt to keep you from popping the breaker on the front. Now, it's still possible to do that because you'll notice there are things that are missing on here. The clothes dryer isn't on here. The cooktop isn't on here. The microwave isn't on here. And all of your other outlets that are in here, like your toaster oven is connected to, and your coffee machine, and whatever else you might be running, like maybe an electric space heater, for example. These aren't on here, so it is still quite possible to pop your 30 amp breaker. But the system does know about these, so that if you do start approaching, or if you go over 30 amps, it will shut other things off that it can in an attempt to make your life easier, but it's not perfect. And because, again, this is an all-electric coach, it becomes a lot easier to run into that situation, primarily because of the cooktop. And there's also a clothes dryer in here, of course, which is going to consume power. So let's go back into settings. Now, there's another page of information that I hadn't been showing you here. So if we scroll down, same sort of situation with the generator. Now, the generator doesn't actually have 50 amps available to it, but you want the RV to pretend like it has 50 amps available to it, and that the generator phase detection is also set to automatic. So it pretends like when the generator is running, it pretends like it's on dual phase 50 amp circuit. The generator can only produce something like 26 or 30 amps, or I forget the exact number of capacity on each circuit. So you can end up popping the generator breaker if you're not careful. Here you can enable or disable load shedding. So for some reason you don't want load shedding to be turned on, you can disable it here. Generator settling just means let the generator run for a little while, get warm up before it starts providing power to the RV. It's safer for your electrical systems and for the generator to have that turned on. And then you can also set your charger, this is what's charging your batteries, to be sheddable as well. And this is actually a little bit more, a little smarter than the load shedding. I gotta go back to this page. This is a little bit smarter than sort of the on or off load shedding. Like, it doesn't just turn the charger on or off. There's two controls you have here. You can say, I don't ever want the charger to draw more than 30 amps, and that's the maximum it can ever, by physical system design, it can't draw more than 30 amps anyway. You can reduce this if for some reason you wanted to reduce this to some lower number. For some reason you don't want to pull that much power for your charger, even though you can reduce it. But with load shedding turned on, I probably can't actually demonstrate this here so much, but with load shedding, turned on, what you're going to notice, and I have observed this, you'll see that the charger, this value will change. It will, if you're approaching 30 amps worth of draw on your 30 amp system, one of the first things it's going to do is lower the amount of power that your charger is drawing from the system in order to allow you to have more power for, say, your air conditioning. So you'll see this number shrink dynamically depending on your loads. And that's pretty much a run through of how this whole system works. And I think through all the examples I've mentioned a few times, you can see how running the New Air on 30 amps can be annoying. It's going to depend on your climate. It's going to depend on your preferences, whether you're running the floor heat or not, whether, how much cooking you do, whether you use a toaster oven, how frequently you're using your microwave, whether you even have a clothes dryer. But for me, especially because I'm full timing, right, I've got all of that stuff. I'm using all of that stuff all the time. And so 30 amps was proving to be possible, but annoying. You just had to be super thoughtful and careful and plan. And, if I got myself into a situation where I was running the clothes dryer and it was time for dinner and I didn't time it right, I was like, oh man, all right, okay, so I can go shut the dryer off so I can cook, right? But that's kind of silly, right? I don't want to be doing that. I don't want to be thinking about that all the time. So I chose to that was one of the reasons I chose to move in order to get a 50 amp site. So I hope that was helpful. I know that's fairly long video just to cover 30 amp service versus 50 amp service. But I think it's important to understand as these coaches get more and more sophisticated and go away from propane and we go to this all electric situation, it puts more and more pressure on your electrical power that's available, and 30 amp service becomes you strain your 30 amp service more and more in that situation. So I thought I'd cover that, and then and also try to give you a bit of an electrical 101 with respect to RVs, because that's important to understand for this, and it's also fairly common to misunderstand that. So and this makes a perfect opportunity to talk about the Ghentari, which I purchased for use with the Oasis. I didn't actually purchase it for use with the generator, although I might get a second one if I end up boondocking somewhere. Because what I've noticed was either with the generator or exhaust or the Oasis exhaust is I would still smell it inside the RV, especially if I had one of the fans inside on, drawing air into the RV. So smelling that exhaust was certainly irritating at best, and certainly not healthy. So because I was in the situation where I was constantly running only the Oasis for hot water, for, well, not I wasn't really using heat in San Diego, at least not frequently, but the Oasis cycles on and off throughout the day, especially of course if you're using hot water. So smelling that was certainly getting irritating. I knew I was going to be camped out in that situation for some time, and so I decided to go with the Ghentari. Now, when you buy the Ghentari, I'm not going to bother taking it out of the bag that it comes in here, but the thing about the Ghentari as you buy it is none of the adapters that come with it are going to be big enough for the pipe that the Oasis, as installed on the New Air, is going to have. So I bought the two I think it's the 2-inch adapter for it. So, and I just leave it installed like this. I removed the tip that was on here, and then I just leave it like this, and this works fine. So because I'm rarely using the Oasis here, I haven't bothered installing the Ghentari, but this just connects in here. Of course, this whole unit goes up towards the roof line, and I also bought the extension in order to make sure that this goes above the roof line. You want the exhaust to go above the roof line, and this is a relatively tall roof, especially because of the rail at the top there. And then it's secured to the side here. One of them I need to mount this again, but it's secured to the side here. You can use suction cups, or you can use something a little more permanent, although not 100% permanent apparently, to secure it here. And that worked well. I had no problems with that. The exhaust of the Oasis is obviously relatively hot, but because the Oasis is intermittent duty, even if you're taking a long shower or something like that, then this plastic I found, I kept coming out here and checking it. Didn't get too hot, didn't melt or anything like that. I've seen some reports about that. The generator, certainly, that's a different situation where the generator is running constantly, way longer than the Oasis is, but the amount of exhaust coming out of the generator and the size of the pipe is smaller and stuff like that. So this is hotter, but it's shorter duration. So anyway, this all fits perfectly in the bag, even with the extension in here. So I keep this with me. It's lightweight and it's pretty easy to install. So that's how I didn't go completely crazy by having to run the Oasis and shut the electrical elements off, which that's something else you'll want to be doing, if you're boondocking. If you're connected to 30 amp service, those are two situations where you'd be running the Oasis, and I found it to be very useful to have the Ghentari set up because of maybe it's specific to the New Air because it's so small and how close this is to the windows. The exhaust was getting inside all the time, so I found this to be a requirement. So any questions on that, certainly let me know as well.